So one person asks about, is there a dichotomy between AI ethics, which seems like a very first world problem, and wars, poverty, environmental exploitation as being a kind of different level of problem, I guess? And so there's an answer here, which somebody else maybe you can comment on whether you agree or have anything to add, which is that AI ethics, they're saying, is very important also for other parts of the world, particularly in areas with high cell phone usage. For example, many countries in Africa have high cell penetration. People get their news from Facebook and WhatsApp and YouTube, and though it's useful, it's been the source of many problems. Did you have any comments on kind of...
Yeah, so I think the first question, so AI ethics, as I noted earlier, and I'm using the phrase data ethics here, but it's this very broad and it refers to a lot of things. I think if people are talking about the, in the future, can computers achieve sentience and what are the ethics around that? And that is not my focus at all. I'm very much focused on, and this is our mission with the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco, is kind of how are people being harmed now? What are the most immediate harms? And so in that sense, I don't think that data ethics has to be a first world or kind of futuristic issue. It's what's happening now. And yeah, and as the person said, and a few examples, well, one example I'll get to later is definitely the genocide in Myanmar, in which the Muslim minority, the Rohingya, are experiencing genocide. The UN has ruled that Facebook played a determining role in that, which is really intense and terrible. And so I think that's an example of technology, leading to very real harm now. There are also, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook. There have been issues with people spreading disinformation and rumors, and it's led to several dozens of lynchings in India of people kind of spreading these false rumors of, oh, there's a kidnapper coming around, and in these kind of small remote villages, and then a visitor or stranger shows up and gets killed. WhatsApp also played a very important role, or bad role, in the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, election of Duterte in the Philippines. So I think technology is having a kind of very immediate impact on people, and that those are the types of ethical questions I'm really interested in, and that I hope you are interested in as well. Do you have anything else to say about that, or? And I will talk about disinformation. I realize those were kind of some disinformation focus, and I'm going to talk about bias first. I think it's bias, then disinformation. Yes?
Question. Mm-hmm. When we talk about ethics, how much of this is intentional unethical behavior? I see a lot of the examples as more of incompetent behavior or bad modeling, where the product or models are rushed without sufficient testing, thought around bias, so forth, but not necessarily malintent.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that most of this is unintentional. I do think there's often, though, well, we'll get into some cases. I think that in many cases, the profit incentives are misaligned. And I do think that when people are earning a lot of money, it is very hard to consider actions that would reduce their profits, even if they would prevent harm and increase kind of ethics. And so I think that, there's at some point where valuing profit over how people are being harmed is... when does that become intentional is a question to debate. But I don't think people are setting out to say, like, I want to cause a genocide or I want to help a authoritarian leader get elected. Most people are not starting with that, but I think sometimes it's a carelessness and a thoughtlessness. But that I do think we are responsible for that, and we're responsible to kind of be more careful and more thoughtful in how we approach things. All right, so bias. So bias, I think, is an issue that's probably gotten a lot of attention, which is great. And I want to get a little bit more in depth, because sometimes discussions on bias stay a bit superficial. There was a great paper by Harini Suresh and John Gutag last year that looked at, kind of came up with this taxonomy of different types of bias and how they had kind of different sources in the machine learning kind of pipeline. And it was really helpful because, different sources have different causes, and they also require different approaches for addressing them. Harini wrote a blog post version of the paper as well, which I love when researchers do that. I hope more of you, if you're writing an academic paper, also write the blog post version. And I'm just going to go through a few of these types. So one is representation bias. And so I would imagine many of you have heard of Joy Balamwini's work, which has rightly received a lot of publicity in Gender Shades. She and Timnit Gebru investigated commercial computer vision products from Microsoft, IBM, and Face++. And then Joy Balamwini and Deb Raji did a follow-up study that looked at Amazon and Keros and several other companies. And the typical results they kind of found basically everywhere was that these products performed significantly worse on dark-skinned women. So they were kind of doing worse on people with darker skin compared to lighter skin, worse on women than on men. And then the intersection of that, dark-skinned women had these very high error rates. And so one example is IBM. Their product was 99.7% accurate on light-skinned men and only 65% accurate on dark-skinned women. And again, this is a commercial computer vision product that was released. Question?
There's a question from the Trimmel study group about the Volkswagen example. In many cases, it's management that drives and rewards unethical behavior. What can an individual engineer do in a case like this, especially in a place like Silicon Valley where people move companies so often?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. Yeah, and that is an example where I would have much rather seen people that were higher ranking doing jail time about this because I think that they were driving that. I think that it's great to remember that I know many people in the world don't have this option, but I think for many of us working in tech, particularly in Silicon Valley, we tend to have a lot of options and often more options than we realize. Like I talk to people frequently that feel trapped in their jobs, even though they're a software engineer in Silicon Valley and so many companies are hiring. And so I think it is important to use that leverage. I think a lot of the kind of employee organizing movements are very promising and that can be useful, but really trying to kind of vet the ethics of the company you're joining, and also being willing to walk away if you're able to do so. That's a great question. So with this example of representation bias, here the kind of way to address this is to build a more representative data set. It's very important to keep consent in mind of the people if you're using pictures of people. But Joy Balamwini and Timnit Gebru did this as part of Gender Shades. However, this is the fact that this was a problem not just for one company, but basically kind of every company they looked at was due to this underlying problem, which is that in machine learning, benchmark data sets spur on a lot of research. However, kind of several years ago, all the kind of popular facial data sets were primarily of light-skinned men. For instance, IGBA, kind of popular face data set several years ago, only 4% of the images were of dark-skinned women. Yes?
Question. I've been worried about COVID-19 contact tracing and the erosion of privacy, location tracking, private surveillance companies, etc. What can we do to protect our digital rights post-COVID? Can we look to any examples in history of what to expect?
That is a huge question and something I have been thinking about as well. I'm going to put that off till later to talk about. And that is something where in the course I teach, I have an entire unit on privacy and surveillance, which I do not in tonight's lecture, but I can share some materials, although I am already really even just like rethinking how I'm going to teach privacy and surveillance in the age of COVID-19 compared to 2 months ago when I taught it the first time. But that is something I think about a lot, and I will talk about later if we have time, or on the forums if we don't. But that's a great question, a very important question. On the topic, and I will say, and I have not had the time to look into them yet, I do know that there are groups that are working on what are kind of more privacy protecting approaches for tracking, and there are also groups putting out like if we are going to use some sort of tracking, what are the safeguards that need to be in place to do it responsibly? Yes?
I've been looking at that too. It does seem like this is a solvable problem with technology. Not all of these problems are, but you can certainly store a tracking history on somebody's cell phone. And then you could have something where you say when you've been infected, and at that point you could tell people that they've been infected by sharing the location in a privacy-preserving way. So I think some people are trying to work on that. I'm not sure it's particularly technically difficult problem. So I think that sometimes there are ways to provide the minimum kind of level of, kind of application with whilst keeping privacy.
Yeah, and I think it is very important to also have things of, a clear, like, expiration date. Like like looking back at 9/11 in the United States, that kind of ushered in all these laws that we're now kind of stuck with that have really eroded privacy of anything we do around COVID-19, being very clear, we are just doing this for COVID-19, and then there's a time limit and expires, and it's kind of for this clear purpose. And there are also issues, though, of, I mentioned earlier about data containing errors. I know this has already been an issue in some of other countries that we're doing kind of more surveillance-focused approaches of, what about like when it's wrong and people are getting kind of quarantined and they don't even know why and for no reason. And so to be mindful of those. But yeah, we'll talk more about this kind of later on. Back to bias. Yeah, we had kind of the benchmarks. So when the benchmark that's widely used has bias, then that is really kind of replicated at scale, and we're seeing this with ImageNet as well, which is probably the most widely studied computer vision data set out there. 2/3 of the ImageNet images are from the West. So this pie chart shows that the 45% of the images in ImageNet are from the United States, 7% from Great Britain, 6% from Italy, 3% from Canada, 3% from Australia. And we're covering a lot of this pie without having gotten to outside the West. And so then this has shown up in concrete ways of classifiers trained on ImageNet. So one of the categories is bridegroom, a man getting married. And there are a lot of cultural components to that, and so they have much higher error rates on bridegrooms from the Middle East or from the global South. And there are people now kind of working to diversify these data sets, but it is quite dangerous that they can really be kind of widely built on at scale, or have been widely built on at scale before these biases were recognized. Another case study is the Compass recidivism algorithm, which is used in determining who has to pay bail. So in the US, a very large number of people are in prison who have not even had a trial yet just because they're too poor to afford bail, as well as sentencing decisions and parole decisions. And ProPublica did a famous investigation in 2016 that I imagine many of you have heard of, in which they found that the false positive rate for Black defendants was nearly twice as high as for white defendants. So Black defendants who were a study from Dartmouth found that it was the software is no more accurate than Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, so random people on the internet. It's also, the software is, this proprietary black box using over 130 inputs, and it's no more accurate than a linear classifier on 3 variables. Yet it's still in use, and it's in use in many states. Wisconsin is one place where it was challenged, yet the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld its use. If you're interested in the kind of topic of how you define fairness, because there is a lot of intricacy here, and I mean, I don't know anybody working on this who thinks that what Compass is doing is right, but they're using this different definition of fairness. Arvin Naranjan has a fantastic tutorial, 21 fairness definitions in their politics, that I highly recommend. And so going back to kind of this taxonomy of types of bias, this is an example of historical bias. And historical bias is a fundamental structural issue with the first step of the data generation process, and it can exist even given perfect sampling and feature selection. So kind of with the image classifier, that was something where we could, go gather a more representative set of images, and that would help address it. That is not the case here. So gathering kind of more data on the U.S. criminal justice system, it's all going to be biased because that's really kind of baked into our history and our current state. And so this is, I think, good to recognize. One thing that can be done to try to at least mitigate this is to really talk to domain experts and by the people impacted. And so a really positive example of this is a tutorial from the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference that Christian Lum, who's the lead statistician for the Human Rights Data Analysis Group and now a professor at UPenn, organized together with a former public defender, Elizabeth Bender, who's the staff attorney for New York's Legal Aid Society, and Terrence Wilkerson, an innocent man who was arrested and could not afford bail. And Elizabeth and Terrence were able to provide a lot of insight to how the criminal justice system works in practice, which is often kind of very different from the more kind of clean, logical abstractions that computer scientists deal with. But it's really important to understand those kind of intricacies of how this is going to be implemented and used in these messy, complicated real-world systems. Question?
Aren't the AI biases transferred from real-life biases? For instance, colored people being treated differently is an everyday phenomenon. Women too.
That's correct, yes. So this is often, coming from real-world biases. And I'll come to this in a moment, but algorithmic systems can amplify those biases, so they can make them even worse. But they are often being learned from existing data.
I asked it because I guess I often see this being raised as if it's kind of a reason not to worry about AI. It's like, oh, it's not.
Well,
AI.
I'm going to get to that in a moment. Actually, I think in 2 slides. So hold on to that question. I just want to talk about one other type of bias first, measurement bias. So this was an interesting paper by Sandil Mullainathan and Zayed Obermeyer, where they looked at historic electronic health record data to try to determine what factors are most predictive of stroke. And they said, this could be useful, like prioritizing patients at the ER. And so they found that the #1 most predictive factor was prior stroke, which that makes sense. Second was cardiovascular disease. That seems reasonable. And then third most, kind of still very predictive factor, was accidental injury, followed by having a benign breast lump, a colonoscopy, or sinusitis. And so I'm not a medical doctor, but I can tell something weird's going on with factors 3 through 6 here. Like, why would these things be predictive of stroke? Does anyone want to think about why this might be? Any guesses you want to read?
No, I mean, there's lots of things.
Someone's, yeah.
Okay, the first answer was they test for it anytime someone has stroke. Confirmation bias, overfitting. Is it because they happen to be in hospital already? Biased data. EHR records these events. Because the data was taken before certain advances in medical science.
These are all good guesses. Not quite what I was looking for, but good thinking.
That's such a nice way of saying no.
So what the researchers say here is that this was about they're patients, they're people that utilize healthcare a lot and people that don't, and they call it kind of high utility versus low utility of healthcare. And there are a lot of factors that go into this. I'm sure just who has health insurance and who can afford their co-pays. There may be cultural factors. There may be racial and gender bias. Or there is racial and gender bias on how people are treated. So a lot of factors, and basically people that utilize healthcare a lot, they will go to a doctor when they have sinusitis, and they will also go in when they're having a stroke. And people that do not utilize healthcare much are probably not going to go in possibly for either. And so what the authors write is that we haven't measured stroke, which is, a region of the brain being denied kind of new blood and new oxygen. What we've measured is who had symptoms, who went to the doctor, received tests, and then got this diagnosis of stroke. And, that seems like it might be a reasonable proxy for who had a stroke. But a proxy is, never exactly what you wanted. And in many cases, that gap ends up being significant. And so this is just one form that measurement bias can take, but I think it's something to really kind of be on the lookout for because it can be quite subtle. And so now, starting to return to a point that was brought up earlier, aren't people biased? Yes, we are. And so there have been dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of studies on this, but I'm just going to quote a few, all of which are linked to in this Sindel Mullainathan New York Times article, if you want to find the studies. So this all comes from, peer-reviewed research. But when doctors were shown identical files, they were much less likely to recommend a helpful cardiac procedure to Black patients compared to white patients. And so that was, same file, but just changing the race of the patient. When bargaining for a used car, Black people were offered initial prices $700 higher and received fewer concessions. Responding to apartment rental ads on Craigslist with a Black name elicited fewer responses than with a white name. An all-white jury was 16 points more likely to convict a Black defendant than a white one, but when a jury had just one Black member, it convicted both at the same rate. And so I share these to show that kind of no matter what type of data you're working on, whether that is medical data or sales data or housing data or criminal justice data, that it's very likely that there's bias in it. There's a question.
No, I was just going to say, I find that last one really interesting, like this kind of idea that a single Black member of a jury, I guess it has some kind of like anchoring impact. It kind of suggests that, I'm sure you're going to talk about diversity later, but I just want to keep this in mind that maybe like even a tiny bit of diversity here just reminds people that there's a range of different types of people and perspectives.
No, that's a great point. Yeah.